The career path of a young man aspiring to become an officer within the Royal Navy during the 18th century was relatively straightforward. With only a few exceptions, they would typically join a warship at a young age, ideally between 11 and 13. Joining at a later age would be considered unfavorable. Seafaring was in fact undeniably challenging, especially during the age of sail, requiring considerable time to master. These youngsters would consequently spend most of their teenage years aboard ship, learning the ropes. They were enlisted into the Navy mostly as a captain's servant. The captain was allowed 4 servants per 100 men, so on a first-rate battleship this would mean that he was entitled to 24 men to assist him. Of course, no captain actually needed that much assistance. Most of these youngsters were there just awaiting promotion to midshipmen. They were quartered in the gunroom and under the supervision of the master gunner. This practice was abolished in 1794, and aspiring midshipmen were instead enrolled as volunteers class 1 on a pay of about £6 per year. To qualify as a midshipman, these youngsters initially needed to accrue 3 years of seafaring experience. However, some influential figures manipulated the system by officially enlisting their relatives in the books of a warship, even though these individuals remained ashore to pursue, for example, their education. As a result, they effectively entered the service as midshipmen without ever having set foot aboard a man-of-war. Before being eligible to sit for the lieutenant examination, which represented the next step in the career of an officer, one first had to serve as a midshipman for 3 years. If unsuccessful in these exams, individuals retained their midshipman status. Consequently, those who repeatedly failed their examination could remain midshipmen indefinitely. This circumstance led to a few unfortunate souls observing their peers ascend to the rank of lieutenant, while they themselves remained midshipmen, as depicted by the character of Mr. Holland in the movie Master and Commander. Another notable case is that of Billy Culmer, dubbed the oldest midshipman in the fleet, who eventually attained the rank of lieutenant at the ripe old age of 57. Remarkably, he is said to have taken pride in this distinction. Otherwise, the typical age one served as midshipman was between 15 and 22 years old. Again, nepotism and cronyism could speed up this process. For example, Admiral Rodney had his son promoted to captain already at the age of 15. This proved to be an unhappy decision, however, since his son was later court-martialed for negligence. Meanwhile, a man of great quality but humble origins such as James Cook was 40 years old when he was quote-unquote made. Made is, by the way, a popular expression signifying one's commission as a lieutenant. Aboard a first-rate ship of the line, there were typically 24 midshipmen, while a 74-gun warship accommodated around 20 of these young men. Smaller vessels such as frigates and sloops typically had about 2 to 6 midshipmen aboard. Consequently, the ratio of midshipmen aboard a man-of-war was similar to that of the previously mentioned captain's servants. Midshipmen were usually quartered on the orlop deck. On larger battleships, they had 2 berths for recreation, study, and dining. However, they did not sleep there. Instead, they hung up their hammocks in the cockpit at night, and like the rest of the crew, they were expected to roll them up at daybreak. One can already imagine the discomfort of being quartered here after a fierce naval encounter. The cockpit indeed served as the location where the surgeon treated wounded sailors during battle, so the scent of blood and sweat must have surely lingered in the air. The atmosphere in the living quarters of midshipmen often exhibited a very recognizable dynamic, given that they were still simple teenagers. Here we could observe a more childish attitude among them, including pulling pranks or even instances of bullying, particularly by the older midshipmen against the newcomers. Midshipmen were expected to cover the costs of their own books, navigational equipment, bedding and uniform. These expenses were quite significant and effectively limited access to this position to the middle and upper class who could afford such items. Sons of merchants or the working class rarely entered the navy with aspirations of becoming officers. Approximately 50% of midshipmen were relatives of professional men such as priests, captains or doctors. The other 50% were from higher echelons of society, namely the landed gentry and aristocracy. In some respects, the regime of the midshipmen was as stringent as that of the ordinary seamen. They received the same food rations, for example, although some affluent individuals received financial assistance from their families for better nourishment. Moreover, they could face equally severe punishments as able seamen, such as enduring the punishment known as kissing the gunner's daughter, which involved being flogged while tied to the barrel of a gun. However, they were often spared the shame of public flogging. Another common disciplinary measure was mastheading, wherein they were compelled to sit aloft up in the rigging on the cross trees for several hours, sometimes enduring stormy and bitterly cold weather. Again, connections could easily influence a captain's attitude towards a particular midshipman, making him more lenient towards the young fellow. Once more, I wish to reference Master and Commander. In this film, we observe Captain Jack Aubrey providing special care to the young Mr. Blakeney, assuming a more fatherly role towards him since the captain is very close to the young man's parents. Now, finally, what were actually the duties of a midshipman? Firstly, they were to actively assist in the watch system under the close supervision of the lieutenant. The ship's crew was divided into 3 watches, spread out over 3 parts of the ship. Midshipmen could also be called upon to take command of one of the ship's boats or even to command a prize, which is a captured ship. During naval engagements, they served as deputies to the lieutenants and as aides-de-camp to the captain. When not on duty, they were expected to study and train themselves in various activities. Typical training sessions including practicing knots, casting lead, training with small arms, and manning the big guns. While at sea, midshipmen were expected to keep a detailed navigational log, which they were required to present to the captain occasionally.